It is my honor today to introduce Professor Noam Chomsky. Noam Chomsky is an institute professor and professor emeritus of linguistics at MIT, widely considered one of the fathers of modern linguistics. Professor Chomsky has also established himself as a political activist and prominent critic of U.S. foreign policy and the nature of American support for Israel in particular. Professor Chomsky has received numerous awards, including honorary degrees from over 30 universities. He has written and lectured widely on subjects ranging from linguistic theory to international politics. Among his recent books are New Horizons in the Study of Language, On Nature and Language, and the forthcoming Hopes and Prospects. I have always considered Noam Chomsky a rare and refreshing source of clarity, especially regarding Palestine and Israel. I think I speak for many of us when I say Noam Chomsky is a tremendous personal inspiration, and I cannot imagine a speaker who would generate more excitement on campus. Please join me in welcoming Professor Noam Chomsky.
Now we can go home. Let me begin by giving credit where credit is due to someone I rarely praise. In fact, I can't remember when I ever have, namely the Jerusalem correspondent of the New York Times, Ethan Brunner. He had a good column this morning. It's worth reading. He's describing the mood in Israel on Independence Day, and he points out that the mood was unusually grim, in fact maybe uniquely so. He refers to quite an interesting letter that was written by one of the major Israeli correspondents, Ari Shavit, in Haaretz. He's kind of a centrist correspondent, very influential. It's an open letter from Shavit to Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, and he says, we don't really know each other, but I know who you are, you know who I am, and I never write letters to people in the government, but the moment is so significant and dangerous that I just have to write you the letter, and he has a long open letter. The letter says that you, Mr. Netanyahu, are maybe the most hated person in the world. In Israel, the left hates you, the right hates you, all my friends hate you. I'm the only person who doesn't hate you. And of course, all the Arabs hate you, and everyone in the United States hates you, and the rest of the world, and so on. And he says, the reason is because it's not your fault. He says, I really like you, I think you're a nice guy. But Israel's facing maybe the worst crisis in its history, and we have to do something about it. And then he runs through the crises. The worst one is just the general attitude in the world toward Israel. Well, he didn't know it, but the day after his letter appeared, there was a poll, an international poll by the Pew Research Center, which incidentally Ethan Brunner also refers to in his column. And the poll was a global ranking of countries as to what people think about them in many countries. And Israel ranked way down at the bottom, in fact, right next to North Korea, almost at the very bottom in attitudes. So the concern is justified. Of course, it's a lot of paranoia and self-righteousness. The world doesn't understand us, everyone hates the Jews, we're right about everything, but there's no point. We can't go along just knowing that. We have to somehow do something that'll convince the world. There are some striking analogies which Brunner didn't bring up. One of them is South Africa. Now, there are a lot of analogies drawn between Israel and South Africa, most of them of pretty dubious quality. But one makes a lot of sense. It has to do with the history. If you go back about 50 years, the mood in white nationalist South Africa was very similar to this. They were aware of it. They were aware that they're becoming a pariah society. They reacted very much the way Israel's reacting today. Large-scale international information systems, effort to explain to people, it's not propaganda, it's explanation, just as it's called in Israel, to explain to them that everything we do is right and just and highly moral and you should understand it and so on. And also kind of circling the wagons, a lot of defiance, shifts to the extreme nationalist right, ultra-nationalist movements, and a lot more. It's all very similar. About that time, about 50 years ago, the South African foreign minister, in a conversation with the American ambassador, told him that we know that there are strong resolutions in the United Nations denouncing us, passed by most of the countries in the world, but he said that doesn't really matter. And his words were, what matters more than all other votes put together is the position of the United States in view of its predominant position of leadership in the Western world. So in brief, there's only one vote in the United Nations. That's yours. As long as you vote for us, the rest of them we don't care about. That was an accurate observation then. It's pretty much an accurate observation today, and it became much more so in the case of South Africa as the decolonization proceeded. Remember, this is 1960. Decolonization proceeded, and protests, international protests against apartheid were more intense. Well, actually, the U.S. continued to support, the history's informative. The United States continued to support South Africa, the U.S. government, the apartheid regime, right through the period of mounting protests at home, too. That continued right through the Reagan years, into the late 1980s. Reagan had to, at that time, he already had to evade congressional sanctions against South Africa in order to make sure that U.S. trade increased as it did. And he also had to ignore even business opposition, which is a little unusual. By then, the business world, by the late 70s, early 80s, the American business world was starting to disinvest. They didn't like what was happening. They thought they should get rid of apartheid. But Reagan overruled it, and it was no small matter. In the South African crimes with U.S. support dwarfed the crimes that Reagan was responsible for in Central America and the Middle East, which were pretty awesome. But in South Africa, it was much worse. I mean, just in the surrounding countries, Angola and Mozambique, South African depredations were responsible for killing about 1.5 million people and causing $60 billion of damage. Not a small thing. And the U.S. government, not the population, not even Congress, not even business, but the government continued to support it right through. Now, they had a reason, and the reason is familiar, a justification. The justification was the war on terror. What we're told these days is that George Bush declared the war on terror after 9/11, which is not quite accurate. He redeclared it. Reagan had declared it when he came into office in 1981. So the centerpiece of U.S. foreign policy is going to be state-directed international terrorism, the plague of the modern age, return to barbarism in our time, and so on. That's all been wiped out of history for a simple reason. Reagan's war on terror very quickly turned into a massive terrorist war with enormous destruction and atrocities, and that's not a good thing to maintain within history, so it's kind of gone away except for the real world. So when Bush redeclared it, the original had been forgotten. Defense of South Africa was justified by the war on terror. 1988, the Pentagon declared that the African National Congress, Nelson Mandela's African National Congress, was one of the more notorious terrorist groups in the world. That was 1988, after everything that had happened. In fairness, I should say that a year ago, last May, Mandela finally was removed from the U.S. terrorist list, so he can now travel to the United States without special dispensation. But that was 1988. And in fact, the apartheid regime looked unassailable. The foreign minister's analysis in 1950 was pretty accurate. As long as they had that one vote, the world could be disregarded. Right at that time, for reasons which aren't exactly known, U.S. government policy shifted. And within 2 or 3 years, apartheid had collapsed. It was gone. That's a lot to say about what followed, not so beautiful, but it was certainly a major victory for freedom and justice. Well, those are important lessons worth keeping in mind. And it's worth keeping in mind that virtually without exception, Israeli actions and Israeli policies are in fact joint policies. They're U.S.-Israeli policies. Israel can go just as far as the U.S. permits, just as far as it supports it, and no further. When Israel does something the U.S. doesn't like, tells them loud and clear, and they withdraw quietly. Doesn't matter who the president is. Under George W. Bush, there were some extreme examples. In fact, Israel relies much more on the United States for diplomatic, military, and economic support than South Africa did. South Africa was getting support from other terrorist states like Britain and others, Israel in particular. But Israel is really not. It's much more dependent on the United States. And it follows that any meaningful change in the relations between Israel and Palestine is going to have to be based on a change here in the United States. Now, there have been substantial changes in past years. So a meeting like this, say, would have been inconceivable as recently as 5 or 10 years ago. In fact, it wasn't long ago that when I and a couple other people tried to talk about these topics, we literally had to have police protection. And the meetings were broken up. Even my own university, MIT, had to have police protection. Meetings were broken up. Couldn't talk about it. It's all radically changed, particularly since the Gaza attack last year, which made a big shift in attitudes and understanding. And it also means that actions are now feasible that weren't even thinkable up until recently. So, for example, the kind that were taken with regard to South Africa after decades of education and protest. It took a long time. But by 1977, Hampshire College, I think it was the first one, did pass a divestment resolution, and by the early 80s, as I say, it was even congressional resolutions. There's a crucial example, in fact, is just that, a divestment from U.S. corporations that are involved in criminal actions in the occupied territories. That focuses right where it should on our activities, focuses on us. That's what we should do anyway. Your responsibility is yourself, not other people's crimes. And it's also the decisive factor in what's going to happen. That's what we can influence. There is a Brown group, Brown Students for Justice in Palestine, which has called for divestment from U.S. corporations that are involved in criminal actions in the occupied territories. So, in other words, it's asking Brown University to keep to the law, international law, in fact, domestic law. That the actions are criminal is not really in question. The wall, the so-called separation wall, which ought to be called an annexation wall that cuts through the West Bank, as many of you I'm sure know, that was subject to a decision by the World Court, the International Court of Justice, which unanimously, including the U.S. Justice, in a separate declaration, unanimously concluded that the Geneva Conventions apply to the occupied territories. The Geneva Conventions very explicitly bar any transfer of population from the occupying power to the occupied territories. So that means any settlement anywhere in the occupied territories is just illegal. De facto in violation of international criminal law, the U.S. Judge Bergenthal, declared. That includes every part of the fence that goes into West Bank territory, roughly 85% of it, which is there not to defend Israel, but to defend settlers who were there illegally, so the wall's illegal. And the same is true of every other settlement. With regard to Jerusalem, which is the area of extreme contention now, the actions are doubly illegal, and not only in violation of international law, but even in violation of very specific Security Council resolutions, which the U.S. in fact agreed to back in the late 60s and the early 70s, when the United States was still part of the world on this issue, departed in the mid-70s. But those resolutions still stand, so that's double criminality. And it was understood in Israel. So in late 1967, right after the June 67 war, Israel, when question of settlement in the occupied territories was beginning to be brought up, Israel's top legal advisor, Theodore Meron, who's a very distinguished international lawyer, he's on the international commissions, human rights commissions and so on, he informed the government that the Geneva Conventions clearly apply to the occupied territories and that any transfer of Israeli citizens there would be in violation of fundamental international law. The Israeli Attorney General seconded that. And interestingly, the person who was really in charge of the occupied territories, Moshe Dayan, he was defense minister, but he was responsible for what happened there. He agreed publicly. He said, yes, it's in violation of international law, but we're going to do it anyway because countries violate international law all the time, so we will too. And he was basically correct. He probably not consciously, but he was essentially repeating what the South African foreign minister said. As long as the master agrees, it doesn't matter if it's in violation of law. The master happens to be a criminal state anyway, and if it authorizes criminal actions, we're okay. Doesn't matter what the law says. And that goes until today. Very strikingly, in fact, rarely even gets reported. In fact, mostly doesn't. But as I'm sure you all know, the big issue, the big international issue is Iran and its possible pursuit of nuclear weapons capability. And, a lot of hysteria about that. Obama just made a big speech in which presented a new nuclear posture and said U.S. Promises not to attack, not to carry out a first nuclear strike against countries that don't have nuclear weapons, with an exception. He said there are outliers, and the main outlier, as he put it, is Iran. So we can carry out a nuclear attack against them, even though they don't have nuclear weapons. Right through this period, Security Council resolutions and so on, there are other things going on. So the International Atomic Energy Agency, which is responsible for monitoring the Non-Proliferation Treaty, last September it passed a resolution calling on Israel to join the Non-Proliferation Treaty and open its facilities, nuclear facilities, to inspection. Europe and the United States tried to block the resolution, but they failed, and it passed anyway. Well, it didn't really matter. It wasn't reported in the United States or in England, one or two notices here and there. Also unreported, except for the Mooney newspaper in Washington, the Washington Times, was that Obama immediately informed Israel that it doesn't apply to them, so they can forget about it. At the same time, the Security Council passed a resolution which got plenty of publicity. It was described as aimed at Iran, so it was good. It called on all states to join the Non-Proliferation Treaty and to settle their disagreements within the framework of the UN Charter and the Non-Proliferation Treaty, meaning by peaceful means. Well, those provisions were directed against the United States. There's only 2 countries in the world that are threatening the use of force, which is also criminal. Take a look at the UN Charter, which bars the threat or use of force in international affairs. But across the spectrum in the United States, the threat of force is considered legitimate, and often the use of force. So yes, it's a criminal state across the spectrum. And so the US and Israel are the only countries that are threatening the use of force, and in fact preparing for it. So whether they'll do it, who knows? But without report here, the United States has recently sent to the island of Diego Garcia in the Indian Ocean, has sent submarine tenders to care for nuclear submarines. The nuclear submarines are undetectable and they can carry nuclear weapons. And it has also sent to Diego Garcia the biggest bombs in the US arsenal, short of nuclear weapons, what are called massive ordnance penetrators, bunker busters they're called. They're aimed specifically at Iran, nobody else. There's a huge 13-ton bombs, which are supposed to be able to penetrate deep into the earth through, thousands of tons of reinforced concrete. It doesn't get reported here, but of course it's known to Iranian intelligence, and it's supposed to be. It's a threat of force. Actually, the Diego Garcia is an island which isn't talked about much, but it's crucial to U.S. International aggression. It's the major base for the bombing of the Middle East and Central Asia and so on. It actually was a British island. The British expelled the population on orders of the master. They appealed to be returned and won in British courts, but as Diane said, law doesn't matter if the master says no, so they can't return. Diego Garcia is part of Africa. The African Union, just a couple of months ago, established a nuclear weapons-free zone. If anybody were really interested in stopping limiting nuclear proliferation, what they'd be doing is supporting nuclear weapons-free zones around the world. Well, Africa finally had one, but they can't implement it because of Diego Garcia. The United States and Britain, loyally trailing behind, refused to allow the nuclear-free treaty to apply to Diego Garcia because they intend to use it. They do use it for storing nuclear weapons and might use it for attacking the outliers. That's incidentally not the only case. There's also a South Pacific nuclear weapons-free zone, which also isn't implemented because the U.S. insists on excluding the Pacific Islands, which are used for bases where the U.S. stores nuclear weapons, nuclear submarines, and so on. So that's not implemented. Come back to another important nuclear weapons-free zone in a moment. Anyway, the outlier is Iran. Now, actually, there are 3 countries that have not ever signed the Non-Proliferation Treaty, nuclear states: Israel, India, and Pakistan. All developed nuclear weapons with U.S. support and are still doing so. Pakistan, it's one of Ronald Reagan's gifts to the world. India, it's accelerated in the last couple of years. Under Bush, there was a U.S.-Indian treaty signed, which is in direct violation of all the international conventions on non-proliferation. It permits India to develop nuclear weapons in secret, and it permits the U.S. to help them by providing them with nuclear technology. Now, the story is it's for civilian use, but everybody knows that the boundary between civilian use and military application is quite small. And furthermore, even providing it for civilian use permits India to divert its technology and research to nuclear weapons, as in fact it's doing quite openly. So immediately after the Security Council resolution I mentioned, India announced, though it wasn't reported here, that it can produce nuclear weapons with the same yield as the superpowers, the US and Russia. Obama quietly informed India that the Security Council resolution doesn't apply to them. Pakistan response to India. So they're openly, in fact, developing new nuclear weapons facilities, uranium enrichment, and so on. Those are the real threats of nuclear weapons in the region. The three countries that refused to sign the treaty and that are backed by the U.S. When they openly defy the Security Council, the International Atomic Energy Agency, and so on. Not the outlier may be a problem, but that's a U.S. issue. And so the U.S. is not supported by the world on this, contrary to what you read. So the call for sanctions, what you read is Iran is defying the international community. International community is a term that has a rather technical meaning. It refers to Washington and whoever happens to agree with it at the moment. So the international community excludes the majority of states in the world, the former non-aligned movement, which vigorously support Iran's right to develop nuclear power, as permitted under the Non-Proliferation Treaty. Everyone agrees. It excludes China and Russia. It excludes India, which is opposed to sanctions. Excludes Brazil, which is pointedly opposed to sanctions. Turkey, the one major Middle East power, doesn't want sanctions. In fact, even the Arab League, which the U.S. is supposedly catering to, they just had a meeting and declared their opposition to sanctions, call for diplomacy. But nevertheless, the international community steadfastly insists on higher sanctions. Incidentally, the American people aren't part of the international community. I haven't seen a recent poll. Opinion may have changed after all the propaganda the last couple of years. But in 2007, a considerable majority of Americans agreed with the world outside the international community. That is, agreed that Iran has a right, the same right as everyone else, to develop nuclear energy. Well, they're the outliers. There was a meeting in Tehran of 60 states a couple of days ago. It's very hard to find out who was there because nothing's covered. But there was a meeting and they came out with a declaration calling for an end to any nuclear weapons. And they called for establishing a nuclear weapons-free zone in the Middle East. Now, that's an interesting proposal. In this case, the U.S. population is overwhelmingly in support of it. And so is just everyone in the world who's polled, at least. Very strong support for a nuclear weapons-free zone that would mitigate and maybe terminate whatever the alleged threats are of Iran developing a nuclear weapons capability. They just called for it in the Tehran meeting. I don't think it was reported here. There are two countries that have a particularly deep commitment to this, namely the United States and Britain. The reason is because when the U.S. and Britain invaded Iraq, they tried to provide a kind of a thin legal cover for it, and the way they did it was by appealing to a Security Council resolution, Resolution 687 in 1991, which called on Iraq to dismantle its weapons of mass destruction. And the U.S. and Britain claimed they hadn't done it. We know that was false, but that was the claim. And that justified their invasion of Iraq. Well, if you bother reading that resolution, you'll see that it commits the signers to establishing a nuclear weapons-free zone in the Middle East. So the U.S. and Britain, over and above all others, have a commitment to this. And if there was a real interest in non-proliferation instead of just rhetorical, that's what would be pursued. Well, going back to Israel, which is not the only beneficiary of U.S. criminality, India and Pakistan are too. But in the case of Israel, they're immune from the International Atomic Energy Agency, Security Council, and in fact, a long record of U.S. vetoes of Security Council resolutions that charge Israel with one or another crime. Actually, the U.S. vetoes resolution charging itself with crimes too. If we had a free education system in the United States, everyone would know that the United States is the only country that has rejected a World Court decision. In the past, it was one of three. Libya and Albania also hadn't accepted them, but they've since accepted them. So the U.S. is in splendid isolation. That was a World Court decision calling on the United States to terminate its terrorist war against Nicaragua. Of course, totally rejected. That went to the Security Council. There were 2 resolutions calling on all states, didn't mention the U.S., calling on all states to observe international law. The U.S. vetoed both of them. France and Britain politely abstained. So there are outliers in the world, but Iran's got an awful government, nobody doubts that. But there are other outliers, maybe more significant ones, certainly more significant for us. Well, it's going back to Israel-Palestine, it's kind of strange on the surface that the conflict persists. Why is it called unresolvable? Toughest problem in the world. I mean, there are plenty of problems in the world where it's hard even to conjure up a solution, to imagine one. In this case, you can not only conjure it up, but everyone knows what it is. And furthermore, the whole world agrees to it outside of the United States and Israel. And in fact, it's even got international law on its side. It's supported by the Arab League, it's supported by the Organization of Islamic States, including Iran. It's supported by the relevant non-state actors like Hamas. The resolution, the basic contours are very well known. 2-state settlement on the international border, pre-June '67 border, perhaps with minor and mutual modifications. That was the official U.S. term back in the late '60s and early '70s before the U.S. departed from the world on this issue. So settlement on the international border is a ceasefire line, so kind of messy, with minor and mutual modifications and various conditions about Jerusalem, refugees, and so on. Well, that's a solution. But much like the nuclear-free, weapons-free zone, there's a barrier, and it's right here. The U.S. won't accept it. And as long as the U.S. doesn't accept it, Israel feels entirely free to continue to violate it. Now, that's been going on since the mid-'70s. In 1976, January '76, the major Arab states brought a resolution to the Security Council calling for a settlement roughly in these terms, recognizing the rights of every state in the region, including Israel, to live in peace and security within recognized boundaries and all the standard diplomatic terminology. It was vetoed by the United States. Again, in 1980, record in General Assembly is similar. A veto by the United States is in fact a double veto, maybe a triple veto. First of all, it doesn't happen, and secondly, it's vetoed from reporting, and third, it's vetoed from history. So you have to look pretty hard to find out much about this. That's what it means to have overwhelming power. Those are some of the prerogatives. Overwhelming power and a very obedient intellectual class, which keeps things quiet, doesn't make sure that young minds aren't distorted by knowing too much about the world. But in fact, in this entire record of 35 years of U.S. rejectionism, there's one exception, and a very illuminating one. It's in 2000, the year 2000. It's not the one people talk about. Everyone talks about the Camp David negotiations, which failed, but that was